Okay, so Bitcoin, it's everywhere right now, right? I mean, you can't really open up, a financial news site or anything like that without seeing Bitcoin kind of dominating the headlines.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting now is you're starting to see, big institutions getting involved,
Yeah.
which, I think for anyone who's been following this space for a while, it's sort of like, okay, the serious money's finally moving in.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
And that, obviously brings up a ton of questions
Right.
about, what this means.
It does, yeah. And to really sort of get into, the guts of what's happening here, we've got a really interesting compilation of information for, this deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at excerpts from a conversation between Michael Saylor and Joe Rogan from last August,
Right.
As well as a FinTech Times article from way back in 2017.
Oh.
A more recent ex-post reply from Saylor from August of last year.
Okay.
And a CCN article from December of 2024.
So for those of you listening in today, our goal is to try to cut through the hype, and really get down to why these major organizations are taking Bitcoin so seriously now.
Yeah.
What are the things that are motivating them to do this?
Right.
What are some of the challenges that they're encountering as they're trying to get in?
Uh-huh.
And what might this mean for the future?
Yeah.
We want to try to understand the why and the how behind this potential transformation.
Right.
So maybe a good place to start is when these big institutions were first, kind of dipping their toes in the water.
Uh-huh.
What were some of the initial hurdles that they were encountering?
Well, I think, according to Saylor, a big part of it was really about needing to see robust infrastructure and clear legal frameworks.
Yeah.
The institutions we're talking about here are like pension funds and large banks. And, for them to really commit,
Right.
there needed to be certain fundamental elements in place, right? So things like having, clearly defined titled rights for institutional investors, so knowing like who owns what legally.
Right.
And dependable legal systems to resolve disputes that might come up.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
Right?
You can't just be allocating, billions of dollars of other people's money into an asset class if the legal ground isn't really solid.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
and he also emphasized the very real risk of theft through, security breaches.
Yeah.
These institutions have fiduciary responsibilities, meaning
Uh-huh.
they have, a legal and ethical duty to act in the best financial interests of their clients or their beneficiaries.
Right.
So the prospect of losing substantial assets, to hackers was a really major deterrent.
Makes sense.
And what's really interesting is that the FinTech Times article that we have from way back in 2017
Wow.
highlights these exact same concerns.
Really?
It really underscores the fact that, these weren't new issues.
Yeah.
Established investors have really had these reservations for quite some time.
Yeah. So those were the, some of the early roadblocks.
Mhm.
What's changed?
Yeah.
Like, what are the catalysts that are starting to shift this landscape and make it
Yeah.
more viable?
Well, Saylor points to a couple of key developments.
Okay.
The emergence of Bitcoin ETFs, for instance,
Right.
provides a regulated and crucially familiar vehicle for institutions to gain exposure
Yeah.
to Bitcoin without needing to directly hold the underlying asset themselves.
Yeah.
And, and the advancements in more sophisticated custodial solutions
Right.
offer a much greater level of security for managing large Bitcoin holdings.
Okay. So it's about creating a more secure and recognizable pathway
Yeah,
for, traditional finance to interact with Bitcoin.
exactly.
Yeah. And speaking of, big players actually getting into the game, the name MicroStrategy
Yeah,
keeps coming up
absolutely.
in this whole conversation.
Right. MicroStrategy's journey is really, I think, a compelling case study. Yeah.
They began purchasing Bitcoin back in 2020.
Okay.
And by late 2024, their holdings had reached an astonishing 446,400 Bitcoins,
Wow. That's a lot.
acquired for a total investment of nearly $28 billion.
That's a huge number.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To put that in perspective,
Yeah.
that's roughly 2% of the total Bitcoin supply
Wow.
that will ever exist.
So how did this massive, accumulation of Bitcoin essentially turn them into a proxy for Bitcoin investment in the traditional markets?
Well, what's particularly noteworthy is how MicroStrategy's stock performance became increasingly correlated with the price movements of Bitcoin.
Right.
So for investors who desired exposure to Bitcoin but preferred to, invest through the established equity markets,
Sure.
purchasing MicroStrategy stock
Yeah.
became a way to achieve that indirectly.
Yeah, like a backdoor.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
essentially functioned as a de facto Bitcoin ETF
Right.
before actual ETFs were widely available.
Yeah, okay, so the infrastructure is becoming more robust.
We're seeing concrete examples like MicroStrategy,
Mm-hmm.
you know, making these significant investments.
Yeah.
Now let's kind of dig into the rationale a little bit.
Right.
Why Bitcoin over something like bonds,
Mm-hmm.
which is, much more of a conventional asset?
Well, this is where Saylor presents a really interesting argument.
Yeah.
He positions Bitcoin as digital capital
Okay.
and suggests that it serves as a superior treasury reserve asset
Yeah.
compared to bonds,
Yeah.
particularly within the current economic environment.
Okay.
He highlights the fact that bonds, when you factor in inflation,
Right.
often produce negative real returns.
Yeah.
In an era where the purchasing power of traditional currencies is being eroded.
Right. Your investments aren't even keeping pace with
No.
the increasing cost of goods and services.
Exactly. Now contrast that with Bitcoin's fixed supply of 21 million coins.
Right.
This inherent scarcity positions it as a potential hedge against inflation,
Okay.
a store of value. That, in theory, should appreciate over time as fiat currencies experience devaluation.
And MicroStrategy's strategy really kind of puts this into stark relief.
It does, yeah. Saylor detailed how MicroStrategy actively used its balance sheet to acquire Bitcoin, and as Bitcoin's price experienced a significant surge in 2024, even crossing the $100,000 mark, their stock price mirrored that upward trajectory, increasing by over 400%.
Wow. Yeah, that was a powerful real-world demonstration
It was.
of his investment thesis.
Yeah.
It hasn't been completely smooth sailing, though, has it?
Right.
I recall seeing reports about periods of significant price volatility.
That's a really important point to acknowledge. As Bitcoin's price experiences fluctuations, MicroStrategy's stock price has followed suit. It did see a substantial drop over 50% from its peak in November 2024. So this really underscores the inherent volatility associated with Bitcoin. However, Saylor's perspective remains focused on the long term, viewing Bitcoin as digital capital that will ultimately outperform bonds despite these shorter-term price swings.
So his focus is really on the long-term value proposition rather than short-term speculation.
Right.
Okay, and that kind of brings us to the concept of securitization. How does the potential for creating new financial products based on Bitcoin factor into this whole institutional adoption narrative?
Well, the potential for securitizing Bitcoin is immense.
Yeah.
This essentially involves taking Bitcoin as an underlying asset and creating new tradable financial products based on its value. Think of things like derivatives or ETFs that track Bitcoin's price. Saylor touched upon this, referencing the earlier strong demand seen with the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust back in 2017, where it traded at a significant premium.
Yeah, I remember that.
Simply because investors were eager to gain exposure.
That was like 110% premium.
Right, a huge premium.
It was crazy.
It really highlights the significant unmet demand at the time. And Saylor anticipates that within the next 5 years, we could see a wider range of mainstream securitized Bitcoin products become available. Perhaps even including leveraged Bitcoin notes.
Interesting.
And this aligns with the anticipation we saw expressed in that 2017 FinTech Times report.
So this would allow institutions to participate in the Bitcoin market without actually having to directly hold and manage the Bitcoin themselves.
Exactly.
Which could alleviate some of those custody and regulatory concerns we were talking about earlier.
Precisely by investing in these securitized products. They're gaining indirect exposure to Bitcoin. And Saylor even hinted that MicroStrategy, with its substantial Bitcoin holdings, could potentially play a role in backing some of these new financial instruments, further embedding Bitcoin within the traditional financial system.
So they could actually become a key player in the infrastructure that supports institutional Bitcoin investment.
Yeah.
Okay, now shifting gears slightly.
Sure.
What kind of advice does Saylor offer to entrepreneurs who are looking at this evolving landscape?
His advice is quite direct.
Okay.
View Bitcoin primarily as a long-term store of value.
Okay.
He cautions against getting too caught up in the short-term price fluctuations and instead emphasizes the importance of building the foundational infrastructure that will facilitate wider adoption.
So building the essential tools and services that will help the Bitcoin ecosystem grow.
Exactly. He also advised caution regarding over-leveraging,
Okay.
highlighting MicroStrategy's own measured approach to taking on debt
Okay.
to finance their Bitcoin acquisitions. They've been strategic in their borrowing,
Right.
ensuring they can weather potential market downturns.
Oh.
And this aligns with a broader trend we're observing in the fintech sector,
Yeah.
where businesses are increasingly exploring Bitcoin as a way to diversify their revenue streams
Yeah.
and attract customers who are interested in cryptocurrencies.
Right. So the key takeaways for entrepreneurs
Right.
seem to be long-term vision and building solid, sustainable infrastructure.
Exactly.
So let's kind of, delve a little bit deeper
Sure.
into this distinction that Saylor makes between Bitcoin as digital capital
Right.
versus Bitcoin as a currency for everyday transactions.
Right.
It seems like he has a very specific perspective on this.
He does. Saylor argues that Bitcoin's primary value proposition in the current environment
Okay.
is as a scarce, decentralized asset,
Okay.
a form of digital gold.
Right.
He draws a contrast between this
Okay.
and traditional fiat currencies, which are subject to inflation,
Right.
and even stable coins,
Right.
which are ultimately pegged to and influenced by those same fiat systems.
So he really emphasizes its fundamental scarcity
Uh,
and decentralized nature as its core strengths.
Absolutely. And this viewpoint really underpins MicroStrategy's long-term holding strategy.
Yeah.
Their primary goal isn't to use their Bitcoin for day-to-day transactions.
Right.
However, it's important to consider the example of El Salvador.
Yeah.
As of late 2024, they held a significant amount of Bitcoin,
Right.
which they adopted as legal tender.
Right. Back in 2021.
Back in 2021, yeah. This demonstrates that Bitcoin can indeed serve as a functional currency
Right.
in specific contexts and under certain conditions.
It's interesting, right?
Yeah.
This tension between Bitcoin's potential as a long-term store of value
Yeah.
and its original concept as peer-to-peer electronic cash for payments.
Right.
Now let's switch over and talk about the whole nation-state adoption thing.
Yeah.
This is another area where Saylor has been quite vocal.
Saylor believes that countries that adopt Bitcoin early on
Okay.
will gain a significant economic advantage,
Okay.
particularly as fiat currencies continue to face the risk of devaluation.
Uh-huh.
His ex-post reply really encapsulates this view.
Right.
The country that prints its own currency to buy Bitcoin wins.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement.
That's a very assertive statement.
Yeah.
And he highlighted some key players.
Yeah, like who?
In this emerging trend, he pointed to the United States and China
Okay.
as holding substantial amounts of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And while these are, major global economies,
Right.
smaller nations like El Salvador
Right.
and even Bhutan, which has reportedly been quietly accumulating Bitcoin through mining operations,
Interesting.
are also part of this trend.
Okay.
Saylor anticipates
Yeah.
that as Bitcoin's price continues on its upward trajectory,
Uh-huh.
we'll see more nation states
Right.
beginning to incorporate it into their financial strategies.
Right. So it almost sounds like a new form of global reserve asset is starting to emerge.
Exactly. And the CCN article from December 2024
Right.
discussed this,
Right.
talked about Bitcoin's potential to reshape
Yeah.
the global financial balance of power.
And if we look beneath the surface, there's a potentially significant geopolitical dimension at play here.
There is.
It could be viewed as a hidden race among nations
Right.
to secure Bitcoin as a hedge against economic instability
Exactly.
and potentially to gain a strategic advantage.
Right.
In this evolving landscape of global finance, the fact that even, major players like the U.S. and China
Right.
are reportedly holding significant amounts
Yeah.
suggests they are, giving this serious consideration.
Yeah, they probably are.
And for smaller nations, it could represent a pathway
Right.
to greater economic sovereignty.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it is fascinating to consider Bitcoin not just as an investment, but as a potential tool,
Right.
in international economic relations.
Right.
This brings up some potentially interesting tensions, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, as Bitcoin increasingly becomes viewed and treated
right.
as digital capital and primarily held by large institutions and nation states, there's a potential tension
Yeah.
that arises with its original vision
Right.
as a decentralized peer-to-peer electronic cash system.
Right.
I mean, if its primary purpose shifts towards being an institutional asset,
Right.
what implications does that have for grassroots adoption
Yeah.
and individual users?
Uh-huh.
Could it become less accessible
Yeah.
or less appealing to the everyday person?
It's a critical question to consider.
Yeah.
And the increasing move towards securitization,
Mm.
while it brings in significant institutional capital,
Right.
also raises questions
Right.
about whether Bitcoin's fundamental decentralized ethos
Right.
could be diluted or altered
Right.
as it becomes more deeply integrated
Yeah.
into the traditional regulated financial system.
So it's this kind of balancing act,
Yeah.
trying to achieve wider adoption
Uh-huh.
and greater legitimacy
Right.
within the existing financial framework,
Right.
without losing the core principles and characteristics
Yeah.
that made Bitcoin such a unique and revolutionary technology in the first place.
Exactly.
So to kind of summarize, this deep dive into all this material today,
Uh-huh.
it really seems like Bitcoin's growing role in institutional finance
Mm-hmm.
is largely being driven by its potential as a scarce digital asset,
Yeah.
a form of digital capital
Mm-hmm.
and a perceived hedge against inflation
Right.
and currency devaluation.
Yeah. And the strategic moves
Yeah.
of companies like MicroStrategy
Right.
really provide a compelling real-world example
Yeah.
of this evolving landscape.
And despite the inherent price volatility
Right.
that we've been talking about,
Yeah.
the increasing interest in investment
Right.
from both institutions and even nation states
Yeah.
strongly suggests
Yeah.
a fundamental shift in how Bitcoin is being understood
Mm-hmm.
and valued within the global financial system.
Mm-hmm.
And considering that Bitcoin's price has continued to climb,
Right.
into April of 2025,
Yeah.
the insights we got from, that conversation between Saylor and Rogan last year
Uh-huh.
remain incredibly relevant
Yeah.
for understanding these current dynamics.
Yeah.
So as you consider all these different facets we've been talking about today,
Uh-huh.
the tension between Bitcoin as capital versus currency,
Right.
the drive for mainstream adoption,
Yeah.
alongside, this desire to preserve decentralization.
Right.
What do you think the long-term impact of increasing institutional Bitcoin adoption
Right.
will ultimately be on the global financial landscape
Yeah.
and on individual users?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a complex issue
It is.
with a range of potential future scenarios
Yeah.
that are definitely worth considering.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay.